If you haven't already grabbed a text sheet or received a text sheet, I'll invite you to take it out right now. As we transition last week from Sefer Bereshit to Sefer Shemot, from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus, I really tried to focus my learning on who is Paro, who is Pharaoh, and what does it mean, what was the transition to this Pharaoh who arose who knew not Joseph. So I wanted to share a little bit of my learning with you about Pharaoh in particular this Shabbat, and about contrasting that experience of Pharaoh with the Israelites. And in particular, just share some of my learning with you about Pharaoh in and of himself. Of course, does anybody know who Pharaoh's favorite chef was? No, you don't know Pharaoh's favorite chef? It was Gordon Ramsay's. Perhaps you didn't know, how is it that Pharaoh made all of his money? He was in charge of a pyramid scheme. And if that weren't enough, really specifically, how did Pharaoh become as successful as he was? The answer is, of course, that he invented the very first return policy. He called it a mummy-back guarantee. Shabbat shalom. I invite you to turn with me now to the first chapter of the book of Exodus. We're going to focus on verses 7 through 10. Here, of course, we read that the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. And then we know, Vayako Melech Hadash, a new king arose over Egypt, who knew not Joseph. And he said to his people that as Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." So what is it that Pharaoh most feared among our ancestors? The answer is that they'd become a great, mighty, and populous nation. Pharaoh was worried that the Israelites were going to overthrow him and the Egyptian leadership. That's what the text seems to suggest was Pharaoh's great fear of the Israelites. So I want to look very specifically at a couple of verses. I've got them in bold. Those of you able to join me on the text study sheet, we're going to look first at verse 8 and then verse 10. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. In and of itself, there seems nothing particularly special about this. It could just mean that time simply passed. We know that Joseph and his generation died out. That was the very end of Genesis. And it could be that over the decades, perhaps even over the centuries, there was another king who didn't know Joseph. And so we turn to Shemot Rabbah, this midrashic commentary on the book of Exodus, right? This is rabbinic exegesis on the book of Exodus. And it says a new king arose. Rav and Shmuel, two of our early sages, try to interpret what this phrase could mean. One of them said, new. A new king arose. It meant he was new. He was not the same king who knew Joseph. It's very easy, very simple. Let's take the Torah at its basic value. It was a new king. The other one says, no, I don't think so. This Pharaoh's decrees were new. And these decrees had punishments attached to them. The rationale of the one that says it was literally a new king, as it was written, a new king arose over Egypt. The rationale of the one that says it's referring to new decrees was based on the idea that it's not written, and a pharaoh died and a new king was anointed. So what is the second one trying to tell us? It wasn't that this is a pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. It was a pharaoh who didn't honor the friendship that pharaoh and Joseph once had. Because if the generations had passed, then it would have told us that that Pharaoh had died. After all, we read at the very end of Genesis that Jacob dies, we read that Joseph dies, and we read that Joseph's brothers have died. So wouldn't it make sense that if that same Pharaoh had died, the Torah would have told us that Pharaoh died, and then a new king arose? So this second rabbi is suggesting that no, maybe it's not a new Pharaoh. Maybe it's just a Pharaoh with new policies. According to the one who said it was a new king, that this Pharaoh didn't know Joseph Makes sense. It's a new guy. Years had passed. According to the one who said that this Pharaoh is not new, but simply that he established new decrees, how could it be? Because after all it says, this was a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And so here the rabbis come to explain that perhaps this Pharaoh was like a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph at all. The rabbis say, why does it call him a new king? Wasn't this the same Pharaoh as before? But the Egyptians said to Pharaoh, let us mix it up with this nation. And Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, you're crazy. Until now we've eaten only because of them, that is Joseph and the Israelites. How can we mix it up with them? Were it not for Joseph, we'd all be dead. Pharaoh didn't listen to the Egyptians who wanted to take on the Israelites. Pharaoh wasn't listening to the injustice proposed by the Egyptian people who wanted to enslave and take advantage of this Israelite nation. However, when this Pharaoh didn't listen to the Egyptians, they deposed him from the throne for 3 months until Pharaoh said to them, fine, whatever you want to do, I'm with you. And then they reappointed him. And this is why it says a new king arose. In other words, our rabbis understand that perhaps it was not actually a new Pharaoh over the land of Egypt, but rather that Pharaoh gave in after being dethroned for 3 months because he wouldn't at first give in to the injustice that the Egyptians proposed. But finally, what did Pharaoh value most of all? Power. And because he valued power more than justice, Pharaoh gave in to the demands of the Egyptians, and thus Pharaoh regained his seat, and he submitted to the injustice that the Egyptians desired, and therefore he began to enslave our ancestors. All right, that's one explanation of this new king arose over Egypt. Let's take on now verse 10 where it says, let us deal shrewdly. Right, Pharaoh says, let us deal shrewdly with these Israelites so that they may not increase. Here in the Talmud, it tells us that Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says that Rabbi Shammai says, 3 noteworthy people were consulted by Pharaoh in that council, where Pharaoh questioned what should be done with the Jewish people. They were Balaam, Eov, and Yitro. Balaam, Job, and Jethro, or Yitro. Balaam, of course, we know is that evil prophet, right, who cursed the Israelites. Job, we know Job from the book of Job, which is all about a seemingly righteous person who went through unexplained travails and trials and truly suffered. And Yitro, the man who has a Torah portion named after him that we'll read in a few weeks, the very same Torah portion in which we read the 10 Commandments, Aseret HaDibrot. Yitro, Jethro, the man to be Moses' father-in-law. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba teaches what occurred to each of them. Balaam, who advised Pharaoh to kill all sons born to the Jewish people, was punished by being killed in the war with Midian. Job, who was silent and neither advised nor protested, was punished by suffering, as detailed in the book for which he is named. Now, of course, what did these 2 advisors suggest to Pharaoh? One suggested profound injustice, right? Balaam was the one who said, kill all of the Israelite baby boys who were born. That's ultimately what Pharaoh tried to do. Right? And because he proposed killing as his form of injustice, God did midah keneged midah, and God punished him by killing. Job, however, Job didn't advise anything bad, but he was silent. He didn't stand up in the face of injustice. And so what happened to Job? Job, who was silent and neither advised nor protested, was punished by suffering. He suffered for his silence. But Yitro, who ran away as a sign of protest, merited that some of his children would sit in the Sanhedrin. Right? Yitro became the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, and therefore his descendants were among the great rabbis of our people. Because Yitro stood up, he protested and eventually had to flee for his life, he was rewarded with having descendants among the great leaders of our people. So here on one hand, we have the activities of the Egyptians, Pharaoh in particular, Pharaoh's advisors as well, who not only gave in to injustice, but supported injustice, perpetuated injustice. And in this week's Torah portion, they stand in clear contradistinction to our ancestors who stood up for justice. Of course, we turn to the first chapter of Exodus, verses 15 to 17. It says, "The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, saying, 'When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live.' Yet the midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live." And so it is that the rabbis teach on account of the righteous women were the Jewish people redeemed. In the face of injustice, these women stood their ground and did what was good and what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Fast forward now to the second chapter of Exodus. Sometime after that, Moshe had grown up. He went out among his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. Moshe saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, Moses struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Why does it say that Moses grew up? Because when he saw injustice, he did something about it. He stood up to the injustice. And of course, we see a little bit later, a few verses later, Exodus 2, verse 16. "Now the priest of Midian, that is Jethro, also named Ruel in the Torah, had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock, but shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock. When they returned to their father Ruel, that is Jethro, he said, 'How is it that you come back so soon today?' The daughters answered, 'An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock.'" So again, here we have how the Egyptians responded to injustice, and here we have how the Israelites responded to injustice. And we see very clearly, as early as the very beginning of Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, that the Jewish people are commanded to stand up to injustice. However difficult it might be, we cannot look the other way. Later in Deuteronomy, we receive the commandment that you shall not remain indifferent. However tough it is, however hard it is to stand up against injustice, however easy it might be to just look the other way, we Jews are commanded not only to focus in on this injustice, but to stand up, to protest against it, to fight against injustice. We are commanded, as we see at the very end of Deuteronomy, to do what is right and what is good in the sight of the Lord, that it may go well with you, and that you may be able to possess the good land that the Lord your God promised on oath to your ancestors. As we prepare for another year, as we prepare to enter 2022 and we see profound injustice around us, profound injustice growing and building, may we be strong enough, may we be righteous enough, may we be good enough to not look the other way, but to truly stand up to do what is right and what is good in the eyes of the Lord. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, and let us say together, Amen.